YouTube. Put it down. Preparing to live stream the meeting. As soon as it does start live streaming, I'll close it down on my browser and then we're good to go. Good. Put it down. That's it. So that's us. We are now live on Facebook. Let me just find you again on my... There we go. So welcome, Carlton. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know that you're a very busy man. And one of the main reasons why I wanted to, interview you was because when we look at the academic sort of literature in the addiction sector, it's primarily the majority of it. In fact, 99.9% of it comes from, a harm reduction type activists and academics. So I know that, you have a more sort of in-depth philosophical, cultural and practical critique of some of the current policies, not just in Scotland, but across the UK. So I'm absolutely, not just the UK, Europe as well. I know that you've looked at this quite extensively, so I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today, and I hope that this will be informative. I'm going to try and not talk at all actually, and just ask you some questions and let you talk. So I'm going to start with, in your view, in your view, how has Scotland's approach to drug policy in particular and its focus on harm reduction, how has that influenced the country's drug-related deaths? And do you see the philosophy of harm reduction as directly contributing to this crisis, or is that an unfair question?
No, I think it's a very good question. I think it's a question that a lot of people don't ask or don't want to ask, but I actually think it's the key question to trying to untangle a lot of this stuff. I just think, just as a kind of intro to this, really, when I talk to people who aren't as versed in the kind of machinations of drug policy, like yourself and kind of fellow colleagues who don't have the insight and the kind of understanding of what policy is happening. When I say that kind of Scotland has an anti-recovery drug policy, people look at me and go, well, what do you mean? They kind of laugh and go, well, what do you mean an anti-recovery drug policy? Surely the whole idea of a drugs policy is to enable drug users and people who have problems with drugs, addicts, to recover. And so there is this, I think, and this is kind of one of the problems that we have, and certainly even talking to people in Scotland, it's kind of quite striking that people don't understand that Scotland doesn't have a recovery-based drug policy. And this is how I kind of got interested in the whole discussion. I don't have a background in recovery, or I'm not a medical doctor. For my sins, I'm a sociologist. Ironically, the very people who drive Scotland's drug policy aren't medical doctors. They're people like me, unfortunately, sociologists. So I was just struck by why is a drug policy not simply not centered on a recovery basis, but actually reject recovery as a meaningful outcome. And then I began to kind of look at the kind of philosophy, or rather, not a philosophy as such, the ideology or dogma of harm reduction. And I think kind of within academia itself, and I think also drug policy, because I think it's actually academics that drive drug policy, certainly in Scotland. It's not politicians, and it's not the medical profession. It's academics who assume positions of kind of influence in the quangos. They assume the influence of experts. And so I've really kind of been trying to uncover and look at the rise of this ideology, this dogma. And certainly within in Scotland, I think it's certainly the case. I would certainly make a case for it in Scotland, but I think also broadly speaking in Europe more broadly, that harm reduction, the ideology of harm reduction, is a driver in terms of particularly drug-related deaths, and certainly the drugs death crisis that currently, tragically, kind of Scotland has topped all kind of European tables for the last certainly 10 or so years. So I think kind of the harm reduction, and it sounds fairly bizarre because you would think harm reduction would be a positive. You're reducing harm, you're reducing the suffering of individuals. But I think at its heart, harm reduction as a kind of ideology begins and stops with harm. And what they mean by harm is not the harm of addiction, but the harm of actually drug taking or consumption. I think there's a key difference here that kind of needs to be spelled out, in the sense of that the problem for harm reduction advocates is not addiction as such, it's how people take their drugs. And so you can really see that clearly in the current discussions around the proposed drug consumption room in Scotland, Glasgow. Has it been established yet, or
Yeah, there's
no?
delays.
But they're talking about it. So you kind of, and some of the discussion around that I think is really interesting and actually quite scary, because there is again an assumption. I was reading some articles recently. There's an assumption that kind of the drug consumption rooms are a bit of a stopgap. They're like a gateway to other services, or they're a gateway to recovery. They're a place where addicts can go, take their drugs safely, and then move on to seeking help. Unfortunately, I think, or rather naively, that is not the case. Drug consumption rooms are the be all and end all of a harm reduction orientated approach. In a properly recovery centered policy, drug consumption rooms wouldn't exist. They'd be anathema, because the idea of allowing somebody to take a drug that is a threat to their life is anathema to the kind of moral compass of recovery. So I kind of, not kind of, I do, or what I've been trying to do, certainly over the last couple of years, 18 months or so, is really pinpoint how the harm reduction philosophy, the harm reduction ideology, is actually a driver, not a solution to certainly Scotland's drug death crisis. And you see that mirrored across Europe as well. And the EU have a harm reduction drug policy, which I think kind of exacerbates the problem of addiction rather than in any way plays a solution to it.
Yeah, and in a way that the literature in this area is, vast, overwhelming. In fact, the harm reduction literature, we could fill every desk in the UK with harm reduction literature, but we couldn't even fill my wee desk in Glasgow with recovery research. But you've also said in some of your papers that, the Scottish Drugs Forum, for instance, has framed abstinence and recovery as discriminatory concepts. How do you see this perspective impacting both public health policy and the societal view of addiction?
Yeah, just in terms of your points about academic papers and research into addiction and the absence of the notion of recovery, I've been reading over the last couple of days, I've been reading some of the research that's been produced over the last couple of years, and quite a lot of it on not simply drug consumption rooms, but the demand for drug consumption rooms in Scotland, very much forwarded by kind of academic stroke harm reduction advocates. And I was reading one article yesterday, and the word recovery, this is the 13-page document on drug consumption rooms, drug addiction, drug deaths in Scotland. The word recovery appears once, and that's in the reference list. At the end, it refers to another document that has recovery in the title.
Yeah. So
I think your point is well made. And again, it's something that is really, it's an eye-opener. It's strikingly, it's almost unbelievable that an academic paper looking at the issue of drug deaths in Scotland and potential policies doesn't even mention the word recovery. So in Scottish drug policy, and as you say, largely driven by organisations like the Scottish Drug Forum, recovery and abstinence have become dirty words. Yeah. Now, I work with colleagues who kind of perhaps share some of the harm reduction ideology, or that kind of share some of that ethos, and they kind of laugh when I speak up or kind of mention what of recovery and what of abstinence. So I think there's a real battle on for people who are really wanting to solve, or at least kind of punch a hole in the drug policy mess that we currently have, is that we are fighting a cultural war over the emptying out of kind of really meaningful terms such as recovery, abstinence. There's been a normalization. I think kind of what the harm reduction ideology does is that it normalizes addiction. Mm-hmm. It naturalizes it. Mm-hmm. It empties the language of any proper meaning. And so, and I'm sure I know for a fact that you've experienced this yourself, Anne-Marie, in the sense that when you use the word recovery, you use the word abstinence, it's thrown back at you as a form of stigmatization. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And basically the idea is that expecting an addict to recover is a form of stigmatization, because it sets an assumption, a social assumption, that the addict cannot live up to. And that the whole framework through which this works is that society shouldn't expect addicts to recover, because that's unfair. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of have a complete naturalization of the status and kind of subject of the addict as a kind of identity, really. What we're really talking about here is kind of identity politics, where the addict, being an addict, becomes just another of array of identity. And I think this is really, really dangerous.
Yeah. Because
it traps the addict in a very harmful situation. Mm-hmm. And it creates a dependency that the addict is unable to kind of break out of. They become dependent on these experts. They become dependent on the state to provide their drugs or provide the safe spaces. So they're trapped in this very, very dangerous, very kind of anti-human state, where their kind of humanity is kind of taken away from them, in the sense that they're not expected to be anything else other than somebody with a drug problem.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I can hear the critics, the harm reduction dogmatic ideologue shouting, that's a very moralistic view you've got there, Carlton. You're judging people. Like this gateway to recovery is always there. Like people don't have, we meet people where they're at, and we're not judging them, and we're being kind. So how would you respond to that? That you're being very moralistic and very judgmental.
Well, if that's how they reply, I say all power to my elbow, really. So I'm going to shout it even a little bit louder. I'm certainly being judgmental, but I'm not, I don't think I'm being moralistic. What I am being, though, is very moral. There's a difference between moralism and being moral. And I think kind of judgment is central to what makes a human being human. It's our morality, it's our shared experiences, it's our ability to tell right from wrong, it's our ability as a community to be able to decide what type of society we want to live in. So I'm being very, very moral. I'm being very, very judgmental. Yes, I expect more of myself and everybody else. And it's actually the harm reductionists that are being kind of moralistic, really, in the sense that they're actually denying addicts the opportunity to be something better than what they actually are. It's a very anti-human, anti-moral debate. And I kind of think that's the crux of it for me. It reduces human beings to just these kind of zombies. And that's what harm reduction does. It reduces, and they can throw all these insults and etc. But I think what we have to do, people who kind of want to again punch a hole in this mess, is actually reclaim. So when they say, "Oh, you're being moral and judgmental," we go, "That's exactly what we're doing because we expect better." And I'm sure the vast majority of addicts expect better as well. They don't want to be addicts anymore. And the only way that they can stop being addicts when they feel that sense that, right, I've got to pull my life together, I've got to try harder, I've got to be a better person. That's what morality is. That's what makes us human.
And one of the things that makes that so much easier is when you have other living, breathing examples of not just, where, meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there. So when someone comes to me seeking recovery, I can show them what it looks like. I can show them how to get there. I can show them a path. I can show them several paths, in fact. So, it's that thing about it's not just virtuous to meet people where they're at. It's virtuous to actually help them get that freedom from dependency and to help them live. No human being was meant to be living a life of chronic dependency. Do you know what I mean? That's not why we're here. So I'd much rather be virtuous rather than virtue signaling. If I can just move on to sort of in Europe, like one of your papers, you spoke about harm reduction has become almost synonymous, and I've found this very much so as well. And thank you for helping shape my thinking in this area as well. Like harm reductions became synonymous with progressive, right? Drug policy. And what risk do you see in this dominant approach, and particularly in light of the recent methadone-related death statistics across Europe?
I think that the recent methadone-related drug figures in Europe are very, very interesting because I think they tell the lie or speak truth to the lie around kind of harm reduction and the more progressive or so-called big inverted commas progressive approaches to drug policy. So, for example, Portugal, which is kind of heralded as the kind of poster boy, if we're allowed to use that gendered term anymore, poster boy of kind of European progressive drug policy. It decriminalizes the use of drugs in I think 2000, first country in the world to do this. And there is there's a little bit of a honeymoon period in which kind of drug deaths stabilize, but they have begun to increase, and that's borne out.
It also opened 62 rehabs across the country.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's, I think the kind of, and I kind of think this is the point, that kind of harm reduction is a driver in the problem of addiction rather than a solution. And I think the kind of notion of the progressive element, and again, I think this is again not confined to drug policy per se,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a wider, particularly within academia, but also kind of wider within kind of policy, particularly elite policy circles, elite networks, particularly at kind of international level as well, where there is a co-option of a set of ideas that are shared and filter out into different spheres. And drug policy is obviously one, but there are others around kind of, dare I say, kind of race, gender. We see this where there is almost, well, not almost, but probably a deliberate attempt to undermine social norms, should I say? You know, common held beliefs that are shared amongst people who experience life together, live together. I kind of think this underpins some of the things we were just talking about around the language of stigma and judgmentalism, in the sense of the kind of emptying out of any kind of meaningful notion of recovery. So there's this quite weird thing going on, which I think is not easy to grasp or not easy to explain, in a sense. And it's something that I'm trying to work through. I was speaking at the Battle of Ideas kind of a couple of weekends ago on some of this stuff. And it is actually, and I've since coming back, I've realized, oh, maybe I think I might have been wrong on some of this stuff. So it's kind of things that I'm trying to work through at the moment. So there's this, but there is this notion that somehow, if a lot of people do it, if it's a social norm, it must be wrong.
Mm.
And I think kind of, I haven't quite worked this out properly, but it explains to a degree the differing approaches, particularly in Scotland, but Scotland are not unique in this. I think Scotland are an exaggerated example of a lot of this stuff, but it's not, they're not the only ones doing this.
Mm-hmm.
It explains the kind of seeming contradiction between, on the one hand, policies towards drinking and smoking, you know, minimum unit pricing, pushing up the price of drink, you know, kind of basically a tax on poverty, a tax on being poor. But again, has had no impact on reducing alcohol-related deaths. In fact, they've gone up. And so you would think policy, maybe there's something to look at here. But no, they go, right, we'll put stuff even higher. So again, you know, policy being a driver of a problem, but also I think the smoking ban, that no doubt the Scottish government will gladly implement, but are being floated by the Labour Party and even the Conservative Party, floated the idea of, you know, banning cigarettes for a particular cohort. By the time they reach the age by which they'll be able to buy cigarettes, they won't be able to buy cigarettes. So that kind of, so there's a relationship there to social norms. Drinking, smoking they might not be good for your health, but in moderation, most people, the vast majority of people, I would imagine, drink. Present company excluded, of course, and smoking. You know, these are kind of normal, inverted commas, activities. They might not be good for our health if we kind of overindulge, but what is these days? But they're kind of normal socially. There's a convention that these are kind of what normal, ordinary people do. However, in terms of addiction, there seems to be, particularly from this kind of progressive elite experts, kind of these elite expert networks that are drive policy, that somehow it's not the addiction that is the problem, it's society's opinion of addiction. It's the way society understands addiction. So, and again, this is the kind of the paradox, the dangerous paradox of the harm reduction mantra, the dogma, is that actually addiction's okay, as long as we manage it, as long as we provide safe spaces. Actually, the real problem is you lot out there, those ordinary people.
Sure.
You scumbags, you bigots that expect addicts to kind of pull their weight and recover. So there's something very, very strange going on, but nonetheless, I think kind of is a real tendency, which is this attack on social norms.
Yeah.
And I think that underpins a lot of the so-called progressive approach to
Yeah.
drugs.
And that absolutely kills me, because it's this emphasis on stigma, that stigma that's the problem. It's your attitude towards addicts and alcoholics that are the problem. That's if you were just nicer and kinder and more compassionate, then they wouldn't, like I don't know what would happen, but they wouldn't be as bad somehow. But also there's this idea that, within the whole structure and the whole service system that somehow that they can control and manage addiction when by its very nature it is addiction and therefore it is uncontrollable and unmanageable. So there seems to be a complete disconnect between what the actual condition is and how it manifests and how it takes over people's lives to this idea, this delusional idea that somehow it can be controlled and managed. So you've said that you describe in some of your papers that harm reduction has been fetishized within this policy space, and I really like that because I've saw the t-shirts, I've seen the posters, I've seen the paraphernalia that goes with this, and that really struck me. And to a certain extent, when I first came into this field, and I was educated out of my instincts around all of this, which was an incredible process, to buy into some of the philosophy, which I'm now sort of moving away from again. But you've said that it's fetishized absolutely within the policy space and reducing addiction treatment to a matter of management rather than resolution. Do you think that this reflects a cultural shift, like we've just been speaking about, and what impact does that have on actual individuals who are struggling with addiction?
Um, I I think it does. Yes, there is a cultural shift that is going on here, and I think that relates to some of the things that we were kind of talking about a little bit just before you've asked this question. In the sense that there seems to be a shift, particularly within policy making, that has moved, and again, kind of throw out these words, that policy has become captured to a degree by this kind of progressive ideology. And this is kind of all levels of policy, all areas, particularly health and welfare, social policy areas, seem to have been captured by this notion that somehow kind of what is described or seen as normal behavior is somehow problematic. But also the premise that, and again, I think this speaks to your point about the cultural shift, but also the point you make about stigma and the seeing just the kind of nutty logic that says that addiction can be managed. The meaning of addiction is that you're kind of not in control of what you're doing. So, but you see, that's not a contradiction to harm reduction, because what they're really saying is that the addict can't manage, but we can manage the addict.
I know.
That's what they're saying. That's the whole point. It's this third party kind of, so actually the addict, if you kind of follow this through, the addict isn't really a concern for harm reduction, so-called progressive compassionate harm reduction. It's the capacity of being the third party manager.
Mm-hmm.
So the addict can't manage their addiction. That's where we step in. That's where we manage it for them. And that's the kind of horrible, anti-human, kind of actually immoral core of it, I think. And so they don't see a contradiction. And one of the things I kind of learned, certainly through kind of speaking to you and kind of your experiences as a kind of charity leader, but also kind of your experiences over the recovery bill and things like that, which kind of I think illustrates and shine a light on that really you can't have a discussion with these people to a degree.
Absolutely.
But I kind of know that in people like your good self are kind of compromised by you have to kind of talk to a lot of these people. But in terms of logic, and I kind of, again, this is something I think we've got to kind of become less naive about, is that you would imagine in a normal world where common sense prevails, that you would be able to have a discussion, a sensible discussion around drug policy with kind of advocates of different positions and politicians and policy advisors. But the point is that there is no longer a shared language.
Yeah.
The language has been emptied. So addiction, as you kind of rightly, for the vast majority of normal people in the world, which I don't know, I count myself as one. I'm not whether I classify as a normal person or not, but you know that for the vast majority of us, addiction, there's a meaning to addiction, and it's one, it's a problem. It's a problem for society, but fundamentally, it's a problem for the individual who is trapped within that mindset, within that subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And also the point that you make that, you know, you cannot manage, the individual addict cannot manage their addiction by virtue of it, because that's the definition of it. That's its meaning. That's what it means. However, these terms have been hollowed out by this kind of slow erosion and this kind of slow policy creep of these notions that stigma is judgmental and kind of this normalization of addiction. So I think kind of what we've got to do is we've got to try and reclaim that language and point out at wherever possible the huge contradictions in the harm reduction and edifice and framework, in the sense that, you know, when we're being judgmental, yes, we are being judgmental. That's the point.
Yeah.
Stigma, there's a case to be made. People should go and read Talcott Parsons, kind of American sociologist, writing in the 50s and 60s. His stuff on stigma is brilliant, because he's basically arguing that within stigma there's a moral center to it.
Yeah.
And it's how we as human beings judge ourselves, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and try and kind of, so he talks about the sick role,
Mm-hmm.
which is how society, modern societies, industrial societies, capitalist societies, has created this notion of the sick role, where if you are ill or unable to function normally within what is expected of, I've used that word again, see, normal. I'm not allowed to use that anymore, am I?
Yeah.
But I'm going to use it. So if we're unable to function normally, society allows us space and time to recover, to readjust ourselves, so that we reintegrate ourselves into society. Parsons calls this the sick role, and implicit in the sick role, he says, is the role of stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And its moral character. It's that which we, as people who are perhaps temporarily placed outside of society because of illness or addiction, find ways and drive ourselves, seek help to kind of reintegrate ourselves in society.
Absolutely. And
now, somehow we've got to kind of make that the point, make that the central point of drug policy.
Well, absolutely, because so often, you know, people's recovery stories include elements of that self-shame, where they've broke their own moral code, where they've, you know, maybe ended up in jail or prison or hospital or something that has brought that shame, you know, whether it be appropriate or inappropriate, but it's brought that self-reflection, that moment of clarity. It's a vital, you know, it's a vital part of the recovery journey for most people to have that awakening or that rock bottom, for want of a better word. But you spoke about the hollowing out of the language, and I remember particularly this starting to take place, certainly to my mind, about 15 years ago, where we started saying that you were in recovery if you say you are. Now, that then, I had sort of always thought, well, yeah, we believe in many pathways to recovery, all are a cause for celebration. I can get with that. But then I started to see other cultural norms sort of, I started to see it as part of a bigger picture, like, well, you're a woman if you say you are. Do you know what I mean? Like, so there was sort of like, I started to break it down as I saw this kind of ideology and this dogma coming in other areas. It made me start to question, like I had said, these things that I had been educated out of my instincts around. And one of the first things that I faced when I came in was, we use the language of clean and sober, right? And I was told very early in my career that using the word clean was stigmatizing. And I thought, well, that's part of the culture that I got well in, and to be fair, when I was using, although my face was washed, I didn't feel very clean. Let's face it, my life was so unmanageable, Carlton, that I wouldn't change my bed for months on end, you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that every addict's like me, but there was a complete unmanageability about normal functioning when I was addicted because I was obsessed and compulsed with, getting the substance. So, this idea of the language, so like I'm not supposed to use the word addiction now, and I see this more and more and more moving towards substance use disorders, which I can see there's a paradox in that because not everybody will be, if we talk about it in terms of cancer, right? So you can have stage 1, 2, 3, 4 in cancer. And I know when I got clean and sober at 25, I was probably in stage 1 or 2. If we measured addiction in that way, I hadn't lost my job, there had been consequences, but the progression hadn't, got to the point where I was in absolute crisis. Although I was in emotional and mental crisis, I wasn't in physical or material crisis. So there was lots of, so there's lots of things that I think is so important what we're talking about. And I've pushed back in recent years, and I'm actually pushing back around the language. I'm using the word addiction. I'm a bit of an outlier even within the recovery community now for doing that. So I'm like, I'm sort of rolling back some of the stuff that I was educated out of, and I think that's a really important lesson. But it does speak to the other culture wars going on as well. I can see the connection. I can't quite articulate the connections yet, but I can see them.
I think the pushback on the language is very, very important because it's through the emptying out of language that these ideas take roots, I think. So I think it's really interesting the way in which we're now expected to talk about people who inject drugs or people who use drugs rather than addicts. So we're not allowed to use these terms because these terms have a judgmental quality to them. They speak to a wider sense that, there's a kind of shared communal social meaning to these terms that society sees as problematic. That's very different, I think, from saying, ooh, look at the addicts, look at the scumbags, blah, blah. But there's a very important point in the idea that addiction is problematic because it is. It's problematic to the individual and it's problematic to society. And I think the hollowing out and the emptying of the language links to some of the things that you're talking about in the wider kind of identity politics and the culture war. Is what links them, I think, is the way in which language has been hollowed out to become fundamentally non-judgmental. So we use terms that are non-stigmatizing. So we use terms that are not judging. So if somebody says, yes, I'm a woman, we don't question that. If somebody...
Be kind.
Yes, so it is this notion of that somehow we're being compassionate individuals. Now, you can be polite, but judgmental at the same time. You can be actually being compassionate is predicated upon being judgmental. Kind of without
Well, there's a
humans being able to make judgments about what's right or wrong, or how
well,
we should view or relate to other people, kind of we're no longer really in a position to be compassionate about
yeah,
anything.
and actually discernment and wisdom comes from that judgment. So,
Absolutely.
and I think, you just even the word addict as well, like, it was important for me to realize that, when I found my tribe of other addicts who were in recovery, right, and, I'll always call my fellow addicts, my name's Anne-Marie, I'm an addict, I will always use that language. But when I found that, it was such a relief for me to know that not only was I an addict, because I couldn't see it before, I was blind to the fact, but that there was a solution, but also that I wasn't, I wasn't like, there wasn't something fundamentally flawed in me, that there was a solution, that I could break this, I could get out of it, and other people were going to show me how to do it. That was absolutely vital.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just move on, you say
Sure.
that the EU has increasingly championed harm reduction, but you suggest that this might erode democratic accountability. And I can see that as well, with this sort of infrastructure, this kind of more global infrastructure and messaging coming from on high. Could you explain how you think harm reduction policies intersect with the concerns around democracy and the state sovereignty? I know that's a big question, but could you have a attempt?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm kind of, I think the way that it immediately relates to it, and you can really see that in Scotland, but this isn't unique to drug policy or its increasingly kind of harm reductionist form. It relates to basically all aspects of policy making and public life in Scotland, and dare I say in the rest of the UK, and certainly at the level of the EU, is the way in which decision making has been privatized.
Mhm.
Decision making is no longer part of the public discourse. It's no longer part of the democratic discourse. So drug policy in Scotland and the UK more broadly, and in Europe as well, is not part of the political discussion. It's hived off to unaccountable NGOs,
Experts.
uh, experts, and kind of organisations like the Scottish Drugs Forum, uh, who are unaccountable
Yeah.
to the public, but they're also unaccountable to the politicians as well, because the politicians have abdicated responsibility for solving the problems
Yeah.
of society, really. So they kind of outsource all these problems to these unaccountable networks of experts.
Mhm.
And I kind of think there's a key point to be made, because you used the inverted commas there about experts. In a sense, they are experts, but I've kind of begun to make a distinction between expertise and expert. Expert is kind of like this professional virtue signaler, this professional kind of interferer in other people's lives, where expertise, we need more expertise, actually. We need less experts, more expertise.
Yeah.
So just to get back, the relationship to the kind of democratic aspect is the way in which policy making has become privatized. It's become cocooned from public scrutiny, because I can't remember ever, certainly my time being in Scotland, ever that public policy on drugs was ever a political discussion. The only time it becomes a discussion is when the
Yes.
drug deaths are. It's never an election issue.
Yeah.
It's not part of any broader debate, except when, for a couple of days or a week at most, best, when the
Yeah.
drug figures are released and everybody goes, oh, whoa, isn't this terrible? We
Yeah.
need more. We need to do more of the same. No, you don't. You need to stop doing what you've been doing for the last 20 years and start
Yeah,
again.
please.
So, so what we need, or what we need to be able to try and do, or find ways, is to have. So I've given that it's what 24 years since, not 24 years, 10 years since the independence
Yep.
referendum.
Yeah.
So I kind of half jokingly tweeted and posted on social media that what Scotland doesn't need a new independence referendum. It needs a referendum on drug policy. And the more I thought about it, the more that began to make sense, because then at least you kind of push for that. It becomes part, it goes back into public ownership. Ordinary people are able then to kind of comment on and hold so-called experts and the politicians accountable for the mess that they created. So we need to be able to, and this is why I think kind of drug policy in particular, because that is a key example of this. So the kind of freedom of speech is very, very central to combating the drugs issue in Scotland, and so too is the push for a kind of more democratic public life. And so I think that's where it really gels with a broader kind of discussion around the quality of public life, the nature of political accountability. Who are these quangos? Who are these policymakers accountable? Nobody. That's why they kind of exist. So we need to find ways to inject politics, democratic politics, back into this debate. How we do that, I kind of, we can throw ideas around, and but I think the point is that there are kind of no quick fixes to this
Yeah.
thing now.
I think
It's gone beyond the sake of just tweaking policy, because now policy has become a key driver in exacerbating the drugs crisis. So my word to the politicians and the harmers is no more. They just stop doing what you're doing, and let's kind of have a clean slate and start again. But that's obviously not going to happen. So we need to find ways to reclaim the accountability that is missing from the drug policy.
Yeah, I think that over the last 4 or 5 years, and there was no great plan to do this. It was just that the press, the media gave us a voice, they were interested in what we had to say. But I think we've certainly been able to educate and influence and start to reframe some of these discussions, which the so-called experts have dominated over for the last 20 years. And I know, I get messages from people all across the world that, quite frankly, astound me, saying, keep going, we're with you all the way and we're behind you and all this, and I'm just really shocked. But anyway, I know that there's a particular attention on Scotland because we've seen like the methadone deaths in particular, rise to the point where there was over 50% of the deaths had methadone in them, this year. And we also saw, which I thought was incredibly interesting, in England that last week, the drug death stats highlighted that over 30%, there'd been a 30% rise in cocaine deaths, which I thought was, this could be the thing actually that realigns us, or that gets us talking again, and gets, because there is no current alternative, substitute medication for cocaine. So could that mean a return to, drug services that actually helped people get clean and sober and free from dependency again? And if that's the case, obviously we would welcome that tremendously. Not because we are abstentionists, which is part of the language that people have sort of tried to, degrade us with, but because we believe that people and expect people to recover. Like, I totally and utterly, if somebody will ask me for help, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to show you how to do this. Like the evidence tells us that people will recover, of course they will, like, but they do need to get access to other people that know how to do that. But anyway, sorry, I'm talking too much. I want to ask you about And in many European countries, harm reduction policies are now seen as compassionate and evidence-based, and these words are thrown at us constantly. And the inference is then if you don't agree, you are not compassionate and you're not being scientific. So do you see or do you believe that harm reduction is inherently lacking in compassion for those that it's meant to help? Or is it the execution of these types of interventions that falls short?
I perhaps it's necessary to kind of make a distinction between harm reduction and harm reduction. That sounds a bit bizarre. So I'm not against harm reduction, small h, small r. You know, you know, trying to prevent
Yeah.
harm to people, particularly drug addicts who are trying to recover, is a good thing. So, I'm not against interventions that actually seek to minimize harm, that facilitate them to be able to make choices about how they move out of addiction into recovery. What I'm against is kind of harm reduction, big H, big R, which is the kind of dominant policy dogma that we now sit under, that frames the discussion that we're having, and that frames the totality of the European and also kind of an American, even global discussions around drug policy, which are framed through this dogmatic, fetishized notion of harm reduction as a kind of ideology. That's what I'm against. And at its core, I think, whilst it claims to be more compassionate, and it usually claims to be more compassionate to the kind of more traditional criminal justice approaches to drug policy, which I'm no big fan of. Kind of locking people up doesn't address anything really, in a sense. So I'm as critical of the criminal justice approach as anybody really. However, at its core, the harm reduction approach, I think, is fundamentally problematic because it doesn't see the addict as anything else other than an addict, and it traps them in that subjectivity. It doesn't allow the addict the choices that are necessary to move from being an addict to moving to something different and hopefully something better, into recovery, basically. Yeah. And the key word here is recovery, which is absent from the lexicon or the language of harm reduction. Not only is it absent, as it kind of illustrated by some of the articles I've been reading of late, which don't even mention it, it's the enemy of harm reduction. They see it as the key problem of the addict's face. So kind of the idea that recovery has become, within drug policy, within the kind of mantra of harm reduction and the harm reduction ideology, which has captured the totality of drug policy across Europe, the UK even. Ironically, harm reduction begins in the UK. It's hard to believe, I know, but Margaret Thatcher's Tory government begin to instigate many of the techniques and characteristics of methadone and safe injecting that have now become the standard tropes of the harm reduction ideology. That is kind of and it at its heart is this notion that recovery is dangerous because it's stigmatized, it's judgmental, it involves the addict actually having to do something that they might be uncomfortable with, which is give up drugs, clean, abstain. So what we need to be where it's really at. And this is the thing that really bugs me, and kind of I'm beginning to kind of play around with looking at kind of taking these arguments up. Harm reduction claims that it's pragmatic. It's dealing with the real world. And you and I can talk until the cows come home about recovery and blah, blah. And if addicts do this and if they're given choices, the harm reductionist goes, that's nonsense. You're talking out of your behind. We're dealing with the problem as it is. We're pragmatic, practical. We're keeping addicts safe. But of course, they're not keeping addicts safe, are they? Because they die and the figures are going up each year. So there's a connection between this very, very low barrier of what a policy intervention is. It kind of has very low expectations of what the intervention is. It has incredibly low expectations of what can be expected of the individual addict, and has a very this is the dangerous element. I think it's a very morbid kind of misanthropic view of humanity. It's a very morbid misanthropic view of the individual, that the individual is incapable of making choices that can make their lives better. So therefore, we, the harm reduction experts, will manage their lives for them. And by doing that, you just trap them in these very dangerous kind of identities.
Yeah.
Whilst at the same time saying this is the compassionate way. It's not compassionate at all. The opposite.
And presuming that they have the higher moral ground because they're being non-judgmental. So, I also see it as being incredibly infantilizing, and also, this idea that it's constantly put across that it's a chronic relapsing condition and therefore you cannot recover from it. And that one of the main reasons why I think I'm 27 years clean and sober was when I met other recovering people, it was there right in front of me. There was people there who were 3 weeks, 5 months, 10 years, 40 years. It was a very obvious and real achievable path. It was completely doable. So if you're being told by a system and a service that it's a chronic relapsing condition, and we are infantilized when we're addicted. We're obsessed and compulsed. So we will hand over responsibility to anybody who'll bloody take it, quite frankly. And who will look after us. So there is a huge I don't know, like I've heard some people call it middle class missionaries, but it's gone beyond that now because there's whole industries of people feeding this system now, and I don't know how we step back from it other than to have discussions that are a bit, personal agency, personal responsibility, like freedom from dependency, about living a good life, like, the good, the true, the beautiful, I'm interested in, honesty and, faith and community and, all the good stuff that that life has to offer. And if we're assigning people to what is essentially palliative care, and it's very obvious to me in the drug consumption room debate in Glasgow, just a quick summary is we've got roughly a £50 million treatment budget. 4 million is now going to be going a year on the drug consumption room, which is essentially palliative care, because those addicts who will use that room do not have access to rehab because there's only 23 rehab beds in Glasgow. You've also got 24 places, 24 beds for heroin assisted treatment. So you can be prescribed heroin assisted treatment twice a day for as long as you like. But those 23 rehab beds only have a 12-week duration. In fact, you might only get 6 weeks. You might have to argue for 12 weeks. So in that £50 million treatment budget, less than 1 million, although Glasgow City Council will claim that it's almost 5 million, but being the obsessive granular type that I am, I know that they're including detox beds, any overnight stay, they're including loads of different beds that are not rehab. So if there's 23 rehab beds in Glasgow and I know how much they cost, I think 17 of them cost £1,000 per week and 7 or 8 of them cost £800 a week. That amounts to less than £1 million a year, and you get £50 million and only £1 million going into a recovery orientation. The other 49 million is going to feed that system and provide harm reduction interventions. that you get what you pay for. So I think there is, and that's the discussion that we've been having over and over and over again. And I think, we'll finish with this, right? Because that's us hit the hour mark, and I know that you're busy. But if you could reshape, just a simple question, if you could reshape Scotland or Europe's drug policy with a more recovery focused, supported approach, what would your top priorities be, and how might they differ from current strategies?
I kind of think, to me, the important aspect is, um, and I think this relates back to the discussion we were having about the broader relationship of many of these kind of policy type debates to the wider world of kind of accountability and democracy and that discussion. To me, I think that what we should be trying to articulate is a publicly owned policy, which is, kind of in a democratic, that's what policy should be. It should be policies that are articulated and devised to help people live in the societies that they want to live in. So I think kind of that is a major, what I think, a huge issue, and a kind of, it's not going to happen overnight by any means. There's huge battles ahead, because this is the one thing that the current policy framework doesn't want you to allow. The last thing it wants is ordinary people sticking their nose in and pointing the finger and says, "Oh, that dock joins to that. Why isn't that? Well, who's accountable for this? Where's all this money going?" That's the last thing they want. But we do need more of that. We do need policy geeks to kind of just follow the money, or kind of follow the experts, follow the influence. I think things like the recovery bill, which you've been involved with, is very, very important, because it flags it as a political public issue. And to me, that's the key issue at present in Scotland, and I think wider afield, but certainly in Scotland, is that it's not a public debate. What we've been talking about here is not the norm within policy circles, within policy development, which it should be. So to me, that's the key, I think, is opening this up to the public, to kind of drawing on what type of drug policy do Scottish electorates really want to see. Let's get all the cards on the table and really, kind of open it up, expose it for what it really is.
Yeah. And I think the Right to Recovery Bill will do that to a certain extent. When it starts to get debated in Parliament, even yesterday, one of the Quangos, the Scottish Recovery Consortium, held an event yesterday about this bill, and they had a consultant come in, a guy called Eric Carlin, who is a regular consultant for the Quangos, so Eric's never had a conversation with me or Stevie, the guy who wrote the bill. He's never spoke to any of the lawyers who helped us write it. The Scottish Recovery Consortium have never spoke to me or Stevie officially about the bill. They've never brought us in to tell people about the bill. So, they've never spoke to the lawyers. There's a and actually I got a report this morning telling me that, from someone who attended the meeting yesterday, that they basically lambasted and slated the bill, which didn't surprise me at all. I was like, I fully expected that, primarily because they are almost fully funded by the Scottish government. So the question for me has to be about, and the debate that is now going to ensue as this goes through the Parliament, is like what you were saying, like what are the excuses? Why, if you're not going to pass this bill, why not? Because this bill would actually give you access to all the current harm reduction interventions that we currently have, including drug consumption rooms. There's even a clause in there that says, and any others that ministers deem fit. But crucially, it would also give you access to current services that are incredibly difficult to access. And we're about to publish our 3-year report in our advocacy service that will give you a glimpse at how difficult it actually is in Scotland to get access to treatment that can help you get freedom from dependency. And actually, a lot of people that come to our service have gave up on even asking for that because they
Mhm.
just know it's not available. And I think that normalization of addiction is a huge conversation that perhaps as the Right to Recovery Bill goes through the Parliament that we'll get the opportunity to discuss further. I really hope
Mhm.
we do.
Well, I hope that's the case. It's kind of it is. I always kind of chuckle to myself when I hear the word Scottish Recovery Consortium because it's an oxymoron, really, isn't it? Because that's the last thing that they're interested in is recovery. I think so. I think that the recovery bill does give an opportunity to begin to broaden this discussion because the discussion is currently and has been for a long time trapped in these expert silos. It's experts talking to one another about oh, harm reduction, drug policy, blah blah blah, without any real. They use the language of kind of lived experience, and kind of, there's a topic for another show, perhaps. Kind of the
Do you
and they
know
kind of draw down on evidence based policy, etc., etc. But they're kind of talking to themselves
yeah,
and influencing. One thing I would say though, I think what we have to begin to understand, and it's certainly something that I've because there's this idea that the quangos such as the Scottish Recovery Consortium and the Scottish Drug Forum are somehow puppets of the government because they're getting funding and they don't want to lose their funding, so they just tell the government what they want to hear. I don't think that's the way it works. These quangos, these organizations actually tell the government what to
mm,
do. Politicians, if you press the politicians, particularly a Scottish politician, particularly a member of the government, we've seen that quite recently on what is your drug policy, they haven't got a Scooby unless it's written down for them by these quangos, by their policy advisors. So I think there's a sense that it's actually the other way around. It's these quangos, and they're in an incredibly powerful position, and this is what's dangerous about them because they're unaccountable.
yes,
Politicians are still accountable to a semblance, but politicians have abdicated the responsibility for these areas, for policy making, for actually running society, and have kind of outsourced it to these very, very dangerous, very, very unaccountable, democratically anti-democratic quasi-statal bodies and quangos who actually dictate to politicians what they should say.
yeah,
So I kind of think that we need to perhaps be a little bit less naive on what the real relationship is here. It's
yeah.
not the politicians telling the quangos, it's the quangos dictating to the
Yeah,
politicians.
I think I would very much agree with that. It's the tail wagging the dog when it comes to the Scottish Drugs Forum and a couple of the other. I think maybe I've got a blind spot when it comes to the Scottish Recovery Consortium because there's always a kind of hope in me, this eternal hope and optimism that they will actually be able to influence it in some way. But I've saw the leadership in that organisation being chose very deliberately by the government. And every time, and I've known some of the people that have went for the CEO position over the years who are real genuine leaders in the
Mm-hmm.
recovery community who have never been given the job. So within the recovery consortium, I do think that there's an element of it being steered and
Mm-hmm.
like it not being, because they're not speaking any sort of language that I understand, like we've had, I've had word today actually, even that the human rights, we've got all this so-called human rights agenda in Scotland, or the human rights bill is about to be renewed. Well, I've just had word today that they're pulling the human rights bill from the next Parliament session. So the
Right.
whole human rights bill based approach, particularly to MAT standards, falls flat because there are no rights in recovery. The
Mm-hmm.
Scottish Recovery Consortium's got a whole emphasis on human rights, and none of these rights are actionable by law, which
Mm-hmm.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
if we passed the right to recovery bill, they would be.
Mm-hmm.
So it all makes sense, but So yeah, I think there's a bit of me that just still lives in hope that eventually the Recovery Consortium will have the leadership that it really needs to push the conversation even into a more balanced area. You know, when I set up the charity, it was always like, you know, we need those harm reduction interventions, but we also need the recovery orientated system. You know, we need to give people the expectation that they can and will recover it, and we're not doing that. So I would just love to see a bit more balance. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, you follow the money and it's not there. You know, we described it
I
earlier.
think I I would hope. Well, I hope you're right. But kind of my rather pessimistic reading of the direction of travel is that organisations like the Scottish Recovery Consortium, and the point that we've been making is that any meaningful content to the word recovery has slowly been
Erode.
emptied, and I see that as the direction of travel for certainly the short term, if not the long term. So kind of again, I take your point that there are individuals within. It's the quangos, not the individuals in the quangos necessarily. It's just the way that these organizations uh, work. I just kind of on the human rights. I know we were supposed to be finishing, but we seem to be going on. But on the human rights thing, I think that's really, really interesting because you're saying that kind of human rights are inactionable in law, but more fundamentally, human rights are inactionable by individuals
Yeah.
because they don't belong to individuals. They require third party intervention. And again, this is very much bound up in the harm reductionist
Yeah.
ethos that it's human rights centered, and there's a whole debate there to be unpacked, and something that I think kind of going forward is something that we kind of concerned
Yeah.
individuals need to do is unpack what actually the human rights context
Yeah.
means in terms of individual rights
Yeah.
and how people move out and take responsibility for their own lives.
Yeah. And it's a weaponization of the whole rights agenda, isn't it? Like we see like organization putting forward drug user rights. And I'm just like, well, what about,
Mm-hmm.
and this is coming from someone, who at one time would have been, yeah, right on, baby. But what about the community? What about my family's rights? What about my community's rights? What with it, there's responsibilities that go with rights. And as an
Mm-hmm.
individual who is completely incapacitated by addiction, by the way, you are not of sound mind when you are obsessed and compulsed, like you're definitely not.
Sorry, this is the element of the third party. So human rights can only be actioned by a third party
Yeah.
who takes the responsibility of the individual that the human right is supposed to be about. So a drug user's human rights cannot be actioned by a drug user,
Yeah.
even if that drug user was the most cognizant kind of individual in the world, because the nature of human rights is that they are third party uh, uh, articulated. You need a third party, an outside body, and this
Yeah.
is the thing about why harm reduction is borrows from and pulls down on human rights language. It's because it's about reinforcing the third party nature,
Yeah.
the ex that it's the expert that actually articulates and acts on behalf of the addict, and just traps the addict in that very dangerous kind of position of being an addict, and doesn't allow them the choices or the facility to make those choices through which they can stop being an addict
Yeah.
and move into something a little bit better for themselves.
Yeah, and that's all we want. All we want is access and choice to those services. And currently we don't have them, but the right to
Mm-hmm.
recovery bill would give us a shout at getting them. So once again, Carlton, thank you so much, and I would love to carry on this conversation, maybe do a series of them, when I can pin you down to a wee hour or two or an hour and a half of your time. I think these are absolutely vital conversations that we need to have, and it's not just about drug policy. This is about
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally about the democratic process, isn't
Mm-hmm.
it? We've seen that been hijacked over and over again. One of the final point that I'll make is, this aspect of the quangos in Scotland is quite unique in the UK because we don't have the equivalent of these quangos in England or Wales or Ireland. There are other influential bodies, but
Mhm.
not in the same way that our structures really support these quangos here. And I'm trying to persuade the Labour government to seriously, or the incoming Labour government perhaps in Scotland, to seriously consider a bonfire there. Wouldn't it be
A,
nice?
bo a bonfire would be very nice. Yeah. I kind of think, yeah, I think you're right in the sense, and this again speaks to the wider issue of, because we're no longer talking just simply about the machinations of a policy. We're talking about the context and the framework through which that policy is made. And if you look at the stuff, I know, for example, Anne-Marie, in your past, I don't know if you've kind of repented yet, but you were certainly somebody who kind of was part of the, I dare say, wasn't really a struggle with it, but no, a kind of the kind of devolution argument and the establishment of Holyrood and the
Yeah,
assembly.
I can still be persuaded either way.
Yep. But if you kind of look at the way that the assembly was established as a political system,
Yeah,
it's very much geared around enabling these very kind of non-democratic
yeah,
organizations. It's already there. It's not something that's kind of been pulled in by the SNP government
yeah,
in
yeah,
recent, it's already there in the framework by which kind of the assembly and kind of restructured the democratic framework by which kind of Scotland organised. So that there's a discussion there, I think, that needs to be had. That this isn't just simply a consequence of an evil
yeah,
set of politicians. It's
yeah,
actually the consequence of what Holyrood
structure.
was set up to do and structured and organised, which it accentuated the anti-democratic nature that was already evident in the UK more broadly. So
Yeah,
I think kind of, but I think you're right in the sense that and I think this is really useful, and at sometimes it gets really depressing. You get really pessimistic because you're banging your head, and every time you bang your head, there's a bigger barrier and a bigger question and a bigger issue. But I kind of think that's quite useful in many ways and very positive because it does begin to shine a light on how these things work and what
yeah.
we have to do to try and combat them. Particularly in the kind of long term going forward. I think short term, we just need to shout and point the finger and do what we're doing. But kind of long term, there are key discussions to be had around the quality and nature of democracy
Yeah.
and the way in which Scottish politics is organised.
I think there's very much for me, it's definitely felt like a David and Goliath situation, like even within some of the international recovery conversations that, organizations that I take part in who are, who are fully bought into the change in language, and I'm sort of questioning that. I do feel like at one time as an organization we were a bridge builder between the harm reductionists and between the sort of recovery orientations, and now I'm just like I, I'm just like, we're not, I don't know who we are. We're
Mm-hmm.
shifting and changing. We've turned into an advocacy caseworker service. But the debate and also the light that is being shone is getting brighter, and our democratic structures, even our political structures, are shifting as well. We've seen like the Labour government suggest these regional assemblies type, federal type, mayor type setups. What does that bring? Does it bring another layer
Mm-hmm.
of politicians, another layer of bureaucracy, more opportunity for influence and
Mm-hmm.
corruption? Like so, yeah, it's a shifting
Mm-hmm.
landscape, and all I can do is do what I've been taught to do, which is to be true to myself. Like you said earlier in the discussion, you don't always get things right, you sometimes get things wrong. That's okay. We're bloody human, do you know what I mean? And we shouldn't be cancelling each other for, making a mistake now and again.
Well, it's
Particularly
about working things out.
Yeah, how are we going to, how can we possibly work this out if can you talk about it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, Carlton, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
I
you. Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk this stuff with you.
Thank you. God bless.
Okay.